How's it going, guys? So, the topic I wanted to talk about today is prayer. I've had a long personal journey with the topic of prayer growing up in a Christian household, and I've had a lot of different people share their viewpoints. Um, a lot of people try to discuss what the Bible really says about prayer. And the Bible doesn't talk about how to pray all that much. The main person that talks about it a little bit, obviously, is Jesus. But there are many instances of people praying in the Bible. Um, so, just to reference quickly, we'll start with a lot of the people that were praying in the Bible. Um, there's basically two types of, I guess you could say, categories of prayer that many people do and that were in the Bible. And one would be like praying for something specific to happen, So, you know, Hannah was praying for a child. Many times the Israelites were praying for basically victory over, an enemy. Um, so that's one type of category. Basically, time people praying for miracles. And then another type of prayer, which is kind of what was popularized, I guess you could say, by David. Um, and I believe like Jesus continued this type of prayer in his ministry, in his life, which is just basically pouring your heart out to God like you would to a best friend, um, and just praying for strength, praying for, guidance. So not as like tangible things, but just using prayer to strengthen yourself. There's a verse, where it says David strengthened himself in the Lord after he was dealing with hardship. So those are kind of the two, I guess you could say, categories of prayer. So now let's talk quickly about what Jesus um, did with prayer. So obviously, like we talked about, he did a lot of prayer for, strengthening himself in God. The most famous one's probably when he's praying throughout the crucifixion weekend, where he prays, in the Garden of Gethsemane for strength. And then, one of the most powerful ones he does, where he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. When he's getting, basically set up to be killed. Um, so the other interesting one is where Jesus talks about, the famous one where he say like Jesus teaches the disciples to pray. Um, so that one, he basically lays out, a prayer, and it's interesting because he kind of covers all the things that now in modern, Christianity, when you have like, someone giving a prayer in church, in the morning church prayer, they kind of hit on all these topics, basically asking for forgiveness, um, you know, praying for strength in troubled times, all those types of things. So, I like that type of prayer. I think that's beautiful. And I think, that's basically on a day to day basis. What's the best way to have a strong relationship with God and have that personal relationship with him is to pray that type of prayer that, Jesus did. So now kind of I want to get into what does it look like in modern times. I think where we have a big problem in Christianity is a lot of people still want to focus on the first part of prayer, the first type of prayer, I should say, that we talked about, which is basically praying for something tangible, praying for things like miracles. In a modern setting, it could be praying for a relative to be healed from cancer. Um, you know, praying for a relative safe passage, and then they get hit by a car or something. Um, and I think that's still a very prominent way that prayer is pushed. You see a lot in churches, praying for healing for somebody that's sick. Um, and of course, many of us have seen things that, seemed, unnatural, that we think, okay, I prayed for my, grandfather to get healed from this, and he seemed to have been healed by it. The doctors can't explain it. Um, Many people have stories like that. In my own life, I have a lot of instances where I feel like that's happened. Um, and then obviously there's still some people that are praying like on a day-to-day basis, many times a day, just praying for strength, pouring out their heart to God. And many people are obviously doing both. So, what problem do we have when it comes to the first type of prayer in modern times? When we're mainly discussing it with people that have left the church, or moved away from God. The problem with that first type of prayer in modern times is, what do you do with the instances of where people are praying for loved ones, and that thing doesn't happen, and that person either passes away, or just something very traumatic happens to that person, and then you see someone else that maybe isn't as holy or pious or even a Christian or whatever, and they seem to have had a miracle, and their prayers were answered. They got cured. They got healed. Um, what do we do with those scenarios? People are going to look at that. It's just human nature, and going to go, why me? Why not me? Why them? Where's the fairness from God? Um, and in my opinion, the worst answer that has been given for many years now by most Christians is, basically God has some like ulterior plan, where if you prayed for safe passage for your parents in a cross country car ride, and they died in an accident, that there's some sort of like ulterior plan that God has, that he basically caused that accident. And I hear the phrase "God took them." It was their time. And they're like 40 years old. So I have a problem with that. And I fully understand. Obviously, if you have a problem with that, or maybe you're watching this because you've had a problem with that, and you're here to hopefully find an answer, uh, to question that. So I know it's gonna be controversial, and conservative Christians are gonna disagree with me. Um, but I feel like God now is looking to use use people as his arms and feet to deal with as an answer to prayer. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you're part of a church community. Your relative gets a rare form of cancer. The hospital they're at, basically says, we have no more answers. We have no more solutions. It's looking like they have 6 months to live. And you bring it to your pastor. They lead a prayer at the church. Someone that was at their church that heard the prayer goes home, really thinks hard on it because of the prayer. God puts in their Holy Spirit, hey, you have that one guy you met, on the subway last week or whatever, who said he worked at, this cancer hospital, and he gave you his business card. You call him up. He says, yeah, I've heard of that type of cancer. We're doing a trial. Um, we have one more spot open, like send this over. And then, you let that person that asked for the prayer know, then they tell their relative, they get connected. That person goes to get the trial and they're healed. I think that is the way that God does prayer now in regards to the first type of prayer, which is, we're all praying for something tangible. So now people are going to say, well, what if it's something like, a farmer praying for rain because of a drought? Like, how would that same process work with that? And I'm sorry, I don't think that God is doing those things on a day-to-day basis. He can do it, and he may do it, or he will do it. But I don't think that that's his modus operandi, if you will, of how he's consistently working in today's time. I don't think people just basically pray like Santa Claus for things to happen, and he just is just going around just snapping his fingers and doing those things like a genie, in today's day and age. You say, well, why? One, you ask, why don't I believe that he does that as much? And two, why would God not be doing that? I personally believe, where I first started having issues with this is, like I said, when people are, basically, how is God arbitrating like who to answer and who not to? That doesn't make sense. Um, And you could say, well, God, again, you could say, well, God has an ulterior plan. It's like, well, okay, but our kids in Africa starving from a drought, is that part of God's plan? What does that 2-year-old baby that died, you know, have to do with, like, how's that helping God's plan? So once you start to look at that and go, okay, this isn't making any sense, then you start to look at why. And God has made it clear from day one that he does not want to be loved through force. He does not want to have, a bunch of yes men robots in heaven with him. He wants a real relationship with us. He wants us to love him and have a mutual, you know, unconditional love. And just think for a second, if any time that anybody prayed for anything that's, basically not life or death, like just, hey God, like I really need a car, my car is breaking down, just bam. Next day, like just a car's out front, you know. Hey God, like I really would like this job. The next night immediately called, like, job offer. And it's like those types of things obviously do happen. But think about if God did that every time for everybody, and it was just basically became like a Santa Claus relationship. What kind of relationship with God is that? That's not free will. That's not unconditional love. That's conditional love. So that's really where I'm at, guys. And this is something that a lot of people are going to struggle with because they feel like it's a snowball effect or a slippery slope that could basically destroy the whole meaning and purpose of prayer. So just to wrap up the video, what is the purpose of prayer then? And again, it goes back to the analogy I did with the cancer and the guy connecting through prayer at his church to solve that issue. Um, for the first type of prayer, I think that's the purpose. It opens up our hearts and minds to be able to have the Holy Spirit connect and make those connections that we need to, basically a ripple effect in a pond to find that solution. And God is just going, being Holy Spirit, this person to think of this idea, this connection they've made, this person, this person, this person, bam, there's a solution. And I firmly believe that's from God. And that's how he prefers to, basically do miracles in this time, to answer prayer in this time. For the second type of prayer, I think that has always been from the dawn of time and will always be alive and operating in the same way. Pouring your heart out to God, strengthening yourself in the Lord. I think that has never changed. And God is always going to be there to listen. He's always going to give you strength, peace, and comfort, to help you get through whatever you're going through. And, he's going to give you both. When you're praying for strength and wisdom, he's also going to give you those connections you need to improve your situation. If you just put in the work and match, what he's doing. So I hope you guys think hard about that. I know a lot of you guys have struggled with that, with prayer, thinking I've prayed for healing. My grandfather's such a good person. How come he's not getting healed? So if you've ever struggled with that, I hope this gives you some potential answers and something that you can think about. Read again what Jesus was praying in his time. Read the Lord's Prayer and think these things through. Think about free will, guys. I think that's really the key. Think about, what the combination of free will and prayer will do. Hope this helped, guys. Put in the comments if you guys have any questions or any disagreements, or if this opened your mind about prayer. Thank you guys so much for watching. God bless.